Okay, welcome back students. Today in our series of miniature lectures on IGCSE poetry set by Cambridge, we look at Charlotte Smith's sonnet, Written Near a Port on a Dark Evening. It's worth pointing out that it's also sometimes called Huge Vapours Brewed Above the Clifted Shore, after its first line, as many originally untitled poems are. Well, I want to do a few things in this video talk. Firstly, I'll give you a few basic details about Smith's life, just enough to make you realise how difficult her life was because of some idiot men. But remember, for Cambridge IGCSE exam essays, we don't need to write much at all about a poet's biography, unless we can make it relevant to the question. Secondly, in this video, I want to give you a small amount of information about the literary period during which Smith wrote, and the period just before hers. Then thirdly and finally, and this will form the majority of this talk, we will perform a close reading of Written Near a Port on a Dark Evening, line by line. Okay, so firstly that brief biography of Charlotte Turner Smith, who lived from 1749 to 1806, so she's basically a late 18th century writer. Well, here is the sad story of a brilliant woman. Smith was born into a wealthy London family. When she was very young, her mother died, and her father, Nicholas Turner, who was a notorious spendthrift, disappeared to travel Europe, leaving Charlotte to be looked after by her maternal aunt. Now, a spendthrift is a person who spends money swiftly and irresponsibly. Now, when her father, Nicholas Turner, returned to England from his fun, mysterious travels abroad, he faced financial problems and he remarried. And these are two facts that led to him arranging the marriage of the 15-year-old Charlotte to a wealthy man called Benjamin Smith, who was also a violent man and, again, a spendthrift. His family were also slave owners, which is where most of their money came from. Indeed, there's very little to like about the Smith family, and Charlotte herself criticised her father for making her marry into it, saying that he had, in effect, made her a legal prostitute. Those were her words. Now, this powerful comment by Charlotte, that she had been made a legal prostitute by her own father, was just one small piece of evidence of her admirably strong early feminist voice. Now, Charlotte's husband, Benjamin, after his own father died, soon tried to illegally spend his dead father's money, and he ended up a debtor in serious debt, and that was a crime in the late 19th century in England. Consequently, he was sent to what was called debtor's prison, and, which might seem very odd to us today, his wife Charlotte was forced to go there with him. Now, while in prison at this time, Charlotte published her first collection of poems, which enabled them to pay their way out of debtor's prison. But Benjamin continued to be a pretty rubbish husband, so she left him and began publishing more and more in order to pay for her children's future. And she wrote a lot from this point onwards. But she still died in relative poverty later on after an incapacitating illness. Now, while all this sounds quite terrible, and it's true that Smith's was a relatively typical story of women who suffered from the financial and social uselessness of men, she was nevertheless a very talented writer of novels and poems, which made her famous in her own day. Her writing often came from her own life, but there's some evidence that she was later airbrushed from literary history, or written out of it, by men who took offence at many of her prose writings, which understandably criticised men, like her husband. And she was then pretty much ignored for another 200 years or so, until her importance as a writer was reasserted by women literary critics in the 1980s and 1990s. Finally, because it's perhaps relevant to our sonnet, Written Near a Port on a Dark Evening, it's worth pointing out that although Smith moved house very frequently, she often lived along the dangerously stormy southern English coastline, where this poem is undoubtedly set. So to cut a long story short then, Smith's life was a difficult one, generally because of the awfulness of the men in her life and the system of male control that existed in her father's and her husband's generations. Okay, so that's a little bit about her life. Secondly, let's look at Charlotte Smith and her literary era, the age into which Smith arguably fits. Now, in order to be clear, I'm going to do something that I don't really believe in. I'm going to simplify and divide English literary history into fixed periods or units of time. Now, just before the time of Smith and her fellow writers, there was a period of history called the Enlightenment. Look, I've written it here, the Enlightenment, which Smith was born into. She was born into the Enlightenment period. But she moved beyond it. Now, what was the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment was an age of science, sometimes called the age of reason, when it was believed that man's rational thought or reason could make everything in the world good, from medicine to society. So long as men used their reason, it was believed all would be well, and society would march forward, led by these rational, reasonable men who had very large thoughts of their own skills. Now, I keep mentioning men deliberately because in the sexist early 18th century Enlightenment, it was believed that reason, or the ability to think rationally, was something possessed by men, whereas women were supposed to be more emotional or prone to sensibility. That is, women were thought to be all about feelings and emotions. Now again, this is relevant to our poem, this gendering of men equal reason and women equal emotion, because in Written Near a Port on a Dark Evening, Smith writes against reason. Look, I'll cross it out again here. She writes against reason and seems to write in favour of emotions. She writes in favour of emotions. Now, this isn't surprising, really, given the idiocy of the supposedly reasonable men in her life. But if the Enlightenment, this period, was roughly the period before Smith, and it was the period into which her father and her husband were born, which literary period does Smith herself belong to? Well, Smith belongs to what we would now call the Romantic period. Look, I've circled it there, the Romantic period. And indeed, she more than just belongs to it. She was actually one of its great early figures in Britain, and she helped to shape it. And like her near contemporary Cooper, whose poem The Poplar Field is also in the Cambridge Anthology, Smith hugely influenced a number of Romantic period poets who are presently more famous than she is. For example, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So she wasn't just a member of the Romantic period, she was very heavily involved in shaping what was going on in literature during the Romantic period. Now, Smith's Romantic period then set itself up in opposition to the Enlightenment. Look, I've drawn a line here, the Romantic period in opposition to the Enlightenment. They were in opposition. If the Enlightenment celebrated a supposedly manly reason, the Romantic period celebrated emotions or feelings, or what we would call sentiment. What was felt was considered to be as important in literature as what was thought. Now, many of Smith's writings were sentimental pieces, or pieces which celebrated emotions, which had previously been dismissed as womanly or low. Now, another important part of this Romantic period in British literature was the idea that nature needed to be admired and experienced as huge and vast, or as the Romantic writers called it, for its sublime power. It was dangerous, it was powerful and dangerous, and you're supposed to be scared of it. It was supposed to overwhelm you as a human. Now, nature was powerful and dangerous then, and in fact couldn't be tamed and controlled, as the previous Enlightenment had believed. Rather, it was massive and overpowering, and to be perceived and celebrated as such, and feared. Literature of this period, Smith's Romantic period, started to be filled with huge, wild landscapes such as mountains and valleys, or, as we see in the poetry of Smith, cliff-lined coasts. So dangerous, huge coastlines with cliffs, mountains and things like that. That's what literature of this period became filled with. And the visual art of the period as well, the drawing and the painting. And so in this period, When Smith at the end here, you see that word reason there, we'll come to that later. When Smith at the end of this poem seems to criticise reason, she's arguing against everything that her father's generation stood for. All of that high thinking stuff which those men used to proclaim but could never live up to. So Smith, as a very powerful woman writer, is saying no to the Enlightenment. Womanly emotion, she is saying, is just as good as reason, just as valid, and just as admirable. And who could argue with her? So to cut a long story short again, this poem's celebration of a sublime and dangerous nature and its criticism of reason in favour of emotion is typical of that literary movement, Romanticism, that literary period, Romanticism, to which Smith belonged. So there we are. That's Smith and her times. Now let's read her poem, Written Near a Port on a Dark Evening. I'll read it, but notice how I read it with a slightly over-the-top sense of drama, fear and danger in the face of nature, which I think is the tone that Charlotte Smith intended. So let's read it. Written near a port on a dark evening. Huge vapours brood above the cliffed shore. Night on the ocean settles, dark and mute, save where is heard the repercussive roar of drowsy billows on the rugged foot of rocks remote, or still more distant tone of seamen in the anchored bark that tell the watch relieved, or one deep voice alone singing the hour and bidding, strike the bell. All is black shadow, but the lucid line marked by the light surf on the level sand, or where, afar, the shiplights faintly shine, like wandering fairy fires that oft on land mislead the pilgrim. Such the dubious ray that wavering reason lends in life's long darkling way. So there we are, a powerful poem in many ways, based upon, in some way, the poet's great life experiences. We have to realise it's probably Charlotte Smith reflecting on her life as much as anything. So let's perform a close reading, line by line. But initially, let's just look at the whole form of the poem, the overall structure. Just look at it. It fits nicely there onto the screen. It's a small poem. Let's look at its shape and how it functions and how it feels and how it sounds, its form or its overall structure. Now, this poem is a sonnet. It's called a sonnet. I've written it here as a sonnet, S-O-N-N-E-T. It's a form that Charlotte Smith helped to repopularise in Britain, actually, after it had gone out of fashion. And some rules of the sonnet that this sonnet also follows are, well, firstly, it's got 14 lines. That's perhaps the most telling characteristic of a sonnet. We know it's a sonnet because it has 14 lines. Secondly, there's a regular metre, or rhythm, if you like. Every line is written in iambic pentameter, meaning that we could read them like this. Let's try and read one here. Huge vapours brood above the cliffed shore. Night on the ocean settles dark and mute. Here, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, 5 times throughout each line. Da-da, 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 da-da is iambic pentameter. Then it has a regular rhyme scheme. A, B, A, B. Shore, mute, raw, foot. A, B, A, B. Then it continues. C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G at the end. And so it has these sort of quatrains, these 4 lines. 4 lines here that rhyme, 4 lines here that rhyme, 4 lines here that rhyme. And at the end, it's got a closing rhyming couplet that brings things to a conclusion. Now, these things are the clues that we can call it not just a sonnet, but we can call it, as I've put here, a Shakespearean sonnet, or if you'd rather, you can call it an English sonnet. So we can call it an English sonnet or a Shakespearean sonnet. And one big characteristic of the English sonnet or the Shakespearean sonnet that might be useful to know here for this poem, because this poem is divided in the same way, is that a Shakespearean sonnet is divided into a huge section of 12 lines there, which set a scene. And then there's two lines at the end, this rhyming couplet at the end, that sort of in which the poet reflects upon the scene and tries to find a moral or a message in the scene. And that's exactly what happens in this poem. There are 12 lines when she sets the scene of a dangerous dark coast where nothing can be seen except some lights on anchored ships, which could lead people astray to their deaths. And then, after those 12 lines of that, in these last two lines, Smith reflects and she says, hey, reason is a bit like those false lights. It looks like it will lead you to safety, but in fact it will lead you nowhere, and maybe even into danger. So that's the structure of this poem, of this sonnet. 12 lines setting the scene, 2 lines that sum things up at the end. Okay, let's go through it line by line, starting with that title. Now, written near a port on a dark evening wasn't the original title of this poem. Originally, it was published untitled and was known, as all untitled poems are, just by its first line, huge vapours brewed above the cliffed shore. So if you want to research this poem, you want to Google it to find more information for revision, you can either look at Google this, the present day title, or the first line of the poem, and you'll find it. Okay, so this first line, huge vapours brewed above the cliffed shore. Now I think we should read this with some drama, because straight away we're introduced to the vast, sublime scene in nature of a coastline or a shore that is cliffed, which means sort of fissured or broken with rocks. And perhaps the word cliffed also, of course, hints at cliffs. This is a huge, imposing and dangerous coastal landscape. Look also at that word vapour. It could mean either storm clouds and or the vast spray thrown up by waves hitting the rocks along the shore. And notice how Smith says that these storm clouds brood, look at this word here, or hang as if they're thinking darkly, angrily or miserably about something. Now, of course, storm clouds can't really brood or think, only humans can do that. And so this is an example of personification. I'll put the word personification here, where the clouds are being treated like a sulking person. Now, those of you aiming for top grades might also point out that the word brood here, could be ambiguous. That means it could have two meanings simultaneously. It means, yes, to think angrily and sulkily, but brood also hints, perhaps, at a creature about to give birth, perhaps as a storm cloud might give birth to a storm. And so right from the beginning of this poem, in the first line, some suspense is created of coming danger, perhaps of a coming storm. So huge vapours brood above the cliffed shore. This is a very powerful, dramatic opening, typical of many romantic period nature poems which were interested in the sublime. Now this second line, night on the ocean settles, dark and mute, continues the personification of nature that was begun in the first line. Again, the scene is being set of darkness and danger as night falls or settles over the ocean, creating absolute darkness and silence. The night is described as mute, look at that word there, mute, or silent, like a person who can't speak. So mute here is the word that gives this line its personification. What's important for us to notice in this line is the way in which Smith is telling us that both senses, sight and hearing, have been taken away by the night. Almost nothing can be heard and nothing can be seen. It is both dark, nothing can be seen, and mute, nothing can be heard. Now the third to fifth lines here, these lines tell us, save where is heard the repercussive roar of drowsy billows on the rugged foot of rocks remote. Now this word save here, what it means in Smith's day is except for. So what she means is everything is mute except for the repercussive roar of the waves on the rocks. Now repercussive means banging and echoing again and again as the waves crash. If you think about it, I don't know, in an orchestra, the drum section is often called the percussion section, isn't it? Percussive means to bang and to echo again and again, so they are repercussive. But look here also in these lines at this alliteration, this repetition of the R sound that goes on at the beginning of many words throughout these few lines. Repercussive, raw, rugged, rocks, remote. Repercussive roar and the rugged fooks of the rocks remote. I think we're supposed to read these as if we're roaring like the waves themselves. So the very sound choices that Smith makes in this poem mimic the sound of the sea itself as the waves bash the rocks. But we've also got a lot of S sounds in these lines. Look at it, look. Repercussive roar, drowsy billows, rocks, still, distance, and so on, all the way through. In fact, all the way through this poem, we've got the repetition of the S sound or the SH sound. And this is another type of alliteration called sibilance, and it's again used for its sound effect. And we see it often in poems about the sea like this one. Poets quite frequently use it to mimic the sound of the sea, and that's what's going on in this poem here. Like the sound of the wind and the water itself as it moves. Now those billows here, the drowsy billows on the rugged foot, these billows, they're the huge waves. Those are waves, she means, that go back and forth against the rocks, throwing up spray. And they're heard as they beat against the distant rocks remote, the distant rocks, or the rocks remote. That means the distant rocks. Now these billows or waves are described using the adjective here, drowsy. This adjective, drowsy. Now again, this could have a double meaning. It could mean that the waves themselves are drowsy or sleepy, or that they make the listener drowsy or sleepy. So the word drowsy can work both ways here. And all this stuff about rocks, ruggedness, look at these words, rocks, ruggedness, cliffed. This continues this whole idea of the sublimeness or the huge dangerousness of nature here at the coast. And I can't remind you often enough that this idea of huge, dangerous nature was at the heart of Romantic period literature. So this is typical of her age. Now, apart from the noise of these waves beating upon these rocks in the distance, there's one more sound that can be heard in the distance, and this is the voices of the seamen or the sailors in their anchored bark. Now a bark here, see this word, a bark is a type of old sailing ship, and this one has been anchored in the storm, presumably as it waits overnight to stay safe from bashing against those rocks. Let's pause a bit. If you look at the notes that Cambridge gives you in the anthology, you can't see them here, they're at the bottom of the page. The notes that Cambridge gives you in the anthology, they tell you that a bark is a boat or a small ship. But in fact, a bark was a relatively large ship, and you should probably pause this video here and go to Wikipedia to look up the word bark, or here bark. We sometimes use the French term, I've written it there, bark. Although Cambridge says it's a small ship, it's actually to you and me quite a large wooden masted ship. So this is quite a large ship that has been anchored to stop it crashing into the rocks. And you should probably mention in any essay how you know that the rocky coastlines of the south of England frequently caused ships to sink during storms, leading to massive loss of life. Again, there's danger and threat in this poem of shipwreck, of a sort that we can only really understand if we close our eyes and imagine a ship being tossed about in an 18th century storm. Anyway, beyond the sound of these waves, we get sailors' voices. Here we are, or still more distant tone voices of seamen, sailors in their anchored bark. And they firstly tell of the watch relieved. These voices tell of the watch relieved. Now, relieving the watch is a formal term at sea amongst sailors, and it means that moment when a fresh officer comes to relieve or take over from an officer who is presently up on deck here at night time, keeping an eye out for danger. It's when you sort of transfer the watch. Now you relieve the watch, the term is relieve the watch. You relieve the watch by using very formal words and commands, shouted out quite loudly between the officers, such as, "I am ready to relieve you," which is answered with, "I am ready to be relieved," and so on. It's a very formal sort of game that you play with words so that everybody knows the watch has been formally passed on from one person to the next. And another sailor's watch, another lonely sailor's voice, a deep one, is singing the hour. Now this means that the sailor is calling out the hour of night that it is, and is then ordering, "Strike the bell," to make other sailors aware that the hour has passed. But I think we're supposed to think of these as lonely and distant voices, and voices of those, if you like, in peril, in danger on the sea. Small voices against the vastness of the ocean, the cliffs, and the general power of nature. And again, this was something very common in Charlotte Smith's day in literature. The smallness of the individual human in the face of the vast power of nature. But we've also here, if we go back to this idea of the watch being relieved, we're singing the hour and we're striking the bell. We've got lots of images here of time passing, haven't we? And maybe Smith is talking about herself getting older, or perhaps even about all of us getting older as life goes on, as we move into night, which might symbolise death in this poem. Maybe. Remember, almost all of Smith's poetry was about herself and her own difficult life situation and the danger that she found herself in her life. Anyway, after dealing with the sounds that can be heard, line 10 here, we have a shift from the sounds to the sights. And we are told that all is black shadow, or all is pitch black, where nothing can be seen at all. But perhaps that phrase, black shadow, also gives a sense of sadness, of being lost in life, as Smith must often have felt lost in her own life as she fought against the cruelty of her circumstances, if you remember the biography that I read earlier. So maybe this is a poem, amongst other things, about the poet Smith feeling lost or disorientated. What can she see? Well, nothing really. She can just see one lucid line or bright line. That means one bright line, that of the surf or of the white wash that is caused when a wave runs up the level, sandy beach. So she can see this line of the white wash running up the beach. Now in the line here, all is black shadow, but the lucid line. The word but again means except for. So everything is black, all is black shadow, everything is black except for the bright line of the surf. That's what it means. But again, in these lines here, in these few lines here, I want you to again look at the alliteration. Firstly, there's that sibilance again. Shadow, surf, sand, ship, shine. All those S or SH sounds, especially at the beginning of the word, is called sibilance. And again, it's there to mimic the sound of the ocean. But there's also, if you look, a repeated L. There's another alliteration here, repeated L, lucid, line, light, level, L, and so on. Lights, Lee. Lots of L's there suddenly appear out of nowhere. And I think that might be even a more visual image than an aural or sound image. I think it's more of a visual image. Possibly the straightness of the letter L, you see it, straightness of the letter L there as it would have been printed, mimics the straightness of the bright line of the surf on the sand. So she could be deliberately using those L's to actually look like the line of the surf on the sand. You might also, there's another way of reading this, you might also want to read the alternating L and S sounds here. Look, L, LS, LS, and so on. These alternating LS sounds as here mimicking the wash and backwash of the waves along the sand, perhaps. The wash and backwash, L, S, L, Yes. So this is in many ways a clever, technically clever poem by a talented poet who combines sound and sight imagery quite wonderfully, quite cleverly, and very powerfully. Finally here, in these two lines here, see those? Before we come to those last two lines of the final couplet of the poem, we have one more thing that can be seen. I think this is quite important. We have afar, that means in the distance, we have afar or in the distance, the faintly shining ship lights, Now Smith compares these ship lights on the dark ocean to fairy fires on land, And I want to pause for a minute to briefly explain what she means by fairy fires, because this is quite important. You might also want to go to Wikipedia and look up this. Look, I've written here will-o'-the-wisp. That's another word for fairy fires. You might want to look that up. Let me explain these fairy fires. Now, across Britain and elsewhere, of course, especially on moorland, you can sometimes in the darkness see small, bright and momentary fires that are probably created by methane in the soil igniting. Now, before science explained such fires in the dark countryside, people often thought that these mysterious lights were caused by fairies or other trickster beings from mythology who wanted to cause you harm. They were called fairy fires or will-o'-the-wisps, and it was thought that these lights would be deliberately lit by the fairies to lead people astray as they tried to find their way in the pitch darkness, often leading these people into danger. Now, frequently in British versions of the fairy fire myth, of the sort that Smith herself would have known very well, the fairy fire, or will-o'-the-wisp, would lead a night traveller to the edge of a cliff, like the cliff we find in this poem, and it would then disappear, leaving him or her, the traveller, in complete darkness and in terrible danger at the top of a cliff, likely to die. Well, Smith says that these wandering fairy fires that bob up and down on the ocean from the ships, these sort of ship lights, are very much like these mythical fairy fires, which on land, she says, mislead the pilgrim or lead the pilgrim astray. Now, I also want you to look at this word pilgrim here. Look at this word pilgrim. Smith almost certainly deliberately uses this word, of course she does. Now, by a pilgrim, she probably means a person who is travelling along the road of life. A pilgrim is somebody who goes on pilgrimage. We know what a pilgrimage is. But here, I think, we've got the pilgrim being somebody who is travelling along the road of life. And she doesn't just mean any old traveller either. She probably means all of us as we travel through life. All of us. So the pilgrim is a sort of everyman figure standing for all of us in this poem. But we shouldn't forget that a pilgrim is, yes, a religious traveller, somebody searching for the truth in faith, in belief, in God perhaps, contrary to men of reason who might be sceptical of faith. So again, this is Charlotte Smith promoting the idea of the importance of emotion and feeling over reason. Then finally, you'll be pleased here, we've come to these last two lines, this final rhyming couplet, which, like most Shakespearean end couplets do, it sort of rounds off the poem with a firm message, a statement, a thought, or a reflection upon the scene created earlier in the poem. So again, just to remind you, in a Shakespearean sonnet, these first 12 lines generally set the scene, and then these last two lines comment upon it. These last two lines comment upon that scene, and that's exactly what we get here. Smith now intrudes into the poem, she now appears into the poem, she intrudes into it and makes a statement. And she states quite explicitly that reason, such an important word, I'm going to highlight it, that reason or rational thought coming from the mind is a bit like those fairy fires that lead a person astray into danger, into peril. Such is the dubious ray that wavering reason lends. It's a way of saying, if I want to paraphrase it, I can rephrase it to mean trickster reason is like dubious or fake fairy fires which cannot be trusted. So we cannot trust reason. So reason itself here is called wavering. That's your adjective. Wavering reason. Can't be trusted. 1 minute it's like this, 1 minute it's like that. So now we're back to near where I began when I said that the literary age that preceded Smith's, this Enlightenment, was all about admiring and following reason. But that the literary age of Romanticism, the Romantic period into which she fitted and helped to shape, that was more about admiring emotions or feelings. That's what's going on at the end of this poem. She's asserting this over this. So in many ways, we might even say that this short sonnet, this short 14-line poem, is a literary manifesto or a statement for Romanticism and against that age of reason, the Enlightenment, which preceded it. She's basically saying, don't trust in manly reason, as it can lead you astray. Instead, have faith in your emotions and give yourself over to experiencing things like powerful and dangerous nature. That's the basic message that's going on here. Very briefly, just to help talk about this word reason a little bit more, I'll mention one other sonnet by Smith, one other sonnet that she wrote, which has the fantastic title, it has this title, On Being Cautioned Against Walking on an Headland Overlooking the Sea because it was frequented by a lunatic. And that's a very long title to another sonnet that she wrote, which you don't have in front of you, but which you can look at. Now in that sonnet, Charlotte Smith argues that contrary to what we might think, the lunatic or the madman is happier than us precisely because he has lost all reason. She says that he is uncursed by reason and therefore can't be unhappy because he doesn't understand his situation. So for Smith then, reason is always a curse. For Smith, relying on reason too much was always a curse, and it would take away your enjoyment of the world. So she was very critical of reason in much of her writing. It was a curse. It was better, she thought, to just live and experience your life and the world of nature, and not to think too much about your own sometimes sad circumstances, like her own sad circumstances in life. So even in our sonnet, written near a port on a dark evening, Smith says in this longer final line, it's slightly longer, it's hexameter, not pentameter, this slightly longer line, she says that life is a darkling way. That means a road that goes ever more into darkness. And maybe that final line is also longer. We can maybe think of a reason why it's longer by 2 syllables and all the other lines. Maybe it's longer to mimic that long road of life that the pilgrim is on. So basically, I'm starting to think here that Smith's sonnet is a poem about her own life. In these last 2 lines, she makes it about her own life. And at the end, she's saying, you could say, my life is terrible, but I won't think too heavily and miserably about it. I will instead live it, experience it, and put up with it. Reason, or thinking too much about it, would make me terribly sad. It's better just to live your life. That's what I think she's saying. And so although she suggests at the end of this poem that life is a darkling way, like her life was miserable and went from darkness to darkness, it's for you to decide as a student whether you believe that she's being miserable about life, or whether, by saying that she'll not reflect or reason too much about its misery, she's actually being very positive and very life-affirming and saying, I'm not going to reflect too much upon the misery of my life, I'm going to live it. Now it's for you to decide how you interpret that. And the examiner, of course, wants to know your own view in any essay. It's a very important part of the mark scheme. Your essays must, throughout, show what you think about these poems. As for me, I quite admire this poem, and I admire Charlotte Smith, certainly, as a writer, and we should all probably read more of her poetry. So, there you are, students. Great good luck in your exams, and thank you again for listening. Goodbye.